In the upcoming election, California voters will have their say on several ballot propositions. And while civil rights and criminal justice make their usual appearance, there are some fundamental questions California voters will be asked to decide, such as whether commercial property should be taxed differently than residential property, and whether gig workers should be treated as employees or independent contractors. We'll ask Ben Christopher with CalMatters to give us the details and the background behind each of the ballot propositions.
Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the wonderful company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, California Emerging Technology Fund, and
Fresno State, where bold begins.
The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Era Energy LLC, BNSF Railway, E&J Gallo Winery, and Harris Ranch and Inn. Thank you. From the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. CalMatters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom committed to explaining California policy and politics. Among the reporting of state policy and politics, they've been very helpful in creating voter guides with explanations and short videos on each ballot measure, descriptions of the most competitive congressional and legislative races, some context for the presidential race, and even an FAQ on voting by mail. You can find that by looking at the link on your screen and going on, and I can highly recommend their work. Our guest is Ben Christopher, a reporter with CalMatters, who's written an excellent summary on this year's propositions. Welcome to the Maddy Report, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get started, can you give us a little background on how this year's list of propositions got on the ballot? And then there's this difference which you noted in your explanation about a constitutional amendment versus a statute versus a referendum.
Sure. So this is a storied part of the way that politics are done and policymaking is done in California. Since 1911, Californians have been able to make and change and overturn laws directly at the ballot box, and that's what we call propositions. So there are two ways that propositions can make their way onto the ballot. The first is through the legislature itself. So 2/3 of both houses, both the Assembly and the Senate, vote to put a measure on the ballot, and they usually do that because they have to for some reason. Maybe the legislature wants to change the state constitution, or they want to give the state permission to borrow money with a bond. In both cases, that has to go to the voters.
And because the Democrats have supermajorities in both houses, they get to do that.
They do get to do that if they can all agree, and that's sometimes easier said than done, depending on how controversial the issue is. But yeah, it's certainly a lot easier these days for Democrats to do that because they do have 3/4 of the seats in the legislature. The other way to get a measure on the ballot, maybe the more well-known way, is through citizens, usually citizens with a lot of money behind them or some special interest behind them. They gather enough signatures to get a law placed on the ballot. So if you've ever been walking to the grocery store and someone's standing out there with a clipboard and they want to get your signature, that's usually what they're doing. And as you mentioned, there are a couple different versions of propositions. So there are statutes, which just is sort of the legal equivalent of a law passed by the legislature, or there might be a constitutional amendment, meaning it's overriding or fundamentally changing some part of the state constitution, which is generally a more kind of profound change. And then lastly, there is a referendum, which is that sometimes the legislature will pass a law, some group of voters don't like it, and so they put that on the ballot, giving voters permission to weigh in on that.
Let's get to it, because we've got a lot to cover here.
Yes,
so
we do.
You talk about are these race and civil rights measures on the ballot this November, and they were put on there before all the racism issues and police brutality issues that have recently come up. The first one is Prop 16, which attempts to end the ban on affirmative action. What can you tell us about Prop 16?
Sure. So this is one of those deja vu measures on the ballot where voters have been are being asked to reconsider something that was on the ballot in previous years. So the history here is in 1996, California voters passed what was called Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action programs for public universities, but also for any public state agency in terms of making hiring decisions or awarding contracts, basically banning those public entities from taking into account race, ethnicity, gender, that kind of thing. Democratic legislators have tried a number of times over the last few years to undo this ban, and it's always run up against opposition, not only from Republicans, but also many Democrats, particularly Democrats who represent large Chinese American communities in California.
Yeah, I was going to say that the Asian community thinks that they're going to be impacted by this.
Well, I think the idea is that if we change the law in such a way where particularly universities can start selectively increasing admissions from underrepresented groups like Black, Latino, Native American Californians, that would necessarily come at the expense of overrepresented groups in the student body compared to their share of the state population, which happens to be particularly Chinese Americans. This year, however, the legislature was able to put this on the ballot in part because there was this wave of protests after the killing of George Floyd, and a lot of legislators really felt like this was the time to start grappling with these sort of structural racial disparities, and so this is why they put Prop 16 on the ballot.
That seems to be the big one when it comes to civil rights on the prop. But there are two others I want to go over very quickly.
Sure.
There's only about 30 seconds left in the segment. One is Prop 17, which would restore the right to vote for some people on parole. And the other is Prop 18, which would give 17-year-olds who are going to turn 18 by the general election the opportunity to vote in the primary.
That's right. Yeah. So the Prop 17 would give people on parole the right to vote. That would be about 40,000 Californians who are no longer in prison but unable to legally cast a ballot or run for office. So that would change that. And Prop 18, as you said, it would allow some 17-year-olds to vote in California in a primary or a special if they are going to turn 18 by the general election.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the property propositions. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our guest is Ben Christopher with CalMatters. He's noted that, quote, this wouldn't be a California election without at least a few wildly contentious ballot measures about housing and property taxes, for sure. And this year we've got a big one. It's probably one of the biggest ones on the ballot. That's Prop 15, referred to as split roll. You might want to explain what that means. Who put this there? What would it do? What can you tell us about Prop 15?
Sure. So as you say, this is definitely one of the more contentious measures on the ballot. In the simplest terms, Prop 15 is a property tax increase on many commercial and industrial property owners. So it would apply to property owners who own at least $3 million in property. And it would raise between $6.5 to $11.5 billion, according to the Legislative Analyst's Office. And that would be split between schools and local governments. So to understand how this actually works, you have to go back and understand this other wildly contentious property tax measure from 1978, which is Prop 13. So Prop 13 basically capped property taxes across the state by setting the amount that a property owner pays as a percentage of the price that they paid for that property rather than the current market value. So if a home was purchased for $300,000 and the value doubles, before Prop 13, the property tax would double as well. But once Prop 13 passed, property tax assessments could only creep up slowly by no more than 2% each year. So it's a big tax break for property owners, essentially. And it applies to both homeowners and business property. What Prop 15 would do is to take that tax break away from commercial and industrial property. So it basically splits homeowners' residential property from business property, placing them on separate tax rolls, so split roll. And again, there would be an exemption for property owners of less than $3 million in property. So if you have a business property and it's more than $3 million and Prop 15 passes, you would have to pay taxes based on however much that store or that business is assessed to be valued currently, rather than the initial purchase price, which in California, as property prices tend to go up, you'd probably have to pay a lot more.
It's pretty amazing because, for years, it's been kind of almost the gospel that Prop 13 was a third rail of California politics. You just don't go there. And now you're seeing polling actually showing that this measure is actually in the lead, which would kind of be a political sea change in California.
Absolutely. I mean, this has been a progressive wish list item for years, and the fact that they finally got on the ballot with the help of the California Teachers Association and many other organized labor groups, I think if it were to pass, it would really mark a big change in California politics.
And just to underscore what you already said, the LAO Legislative Analyst's Office is talking this could raise anywhere from $6.5 to $11.5 billion a year. The split would be about 60% for city and county government and about 40% for K-12 and community college education. So that would be kind of how that would work out. So a very, very important measure on the ballot.
Which even in California, that's a lot of money.
Yeah. A billion here, a billion there. Let's talk about Prop 19, which addresses property tax breaks by closing what's called the Lebowski loophole. Can you explain?
Yeah, this is kind of the Frankenstein's monster of propositions. It kind of cobbles together all these different things. So first component, it would allow homeowners who are over the age of 55 or who are disabled or who are the victims of wildfire to retain a portion of their current tax assessment that they pay on their home when they move to a new home. So again, we were just talking about Prop 13 from 1978. Under Prop 13, you pay property taxes based on the purchase price. And that in some ways creates a kind of disincentive to move if you've been living in the same place for a long time, because as long as you stay in your home, you get to keep paying taxes indexed to that initial purchase price. And if you move to a new home, then you have to pay the property tax based on that new, probably much higher price. And so easing that transition, making it easier, particularly for baby boomers who are maybe empty nesters, to move out, make room for new families. That's been this big goal of the California realtors. And they put this measure on the ballot actually in 2018, and it failed pretty miserably. And so they've added a few more components as kind of sweeteners to get other groups on board. And so one would be to remove the ability of people who inherit homes from their parents or grandparents to keep their low property tax assessment, to inherit that property tax assessment, unless it's used as a principal residence. And even then, only getting that tax break on the first $1 million in additional value. And so if maybe some of your viewers saw this LA Times article about this issue from last year, which showed that some very wealthy Californians, including the actor Jeff Bridges, were paying these 1970s era taxes on rental properties that they had inherited from their parents thanks to this tax break. And so Jeff Bridges was in the Big Lebowski, so hence the Lebowski loophole would close that.
The second thing they did was kind of interesting politically, and that was that they're giving this money that's being raised to fire protection stuff. So the timing is certainly interesting, and actually probably politically pretty smart. We got about 1 minute left in this segment, but I wanted to ask you about an oldie but goodie, and that's rent control, Prop 21. Most people are aware of the housing crisis. What would Prop 21 do?
Sure. So under California law, there is a freeze on any new rent control ordinances across the state. Cities have not been able to enact or expand existing rent control since 1995. Prop 22 would do away with that ban. So it's not necessarily a state rent control policy. In most places, if it passes, nothing would change immediately, but it would allow cities to have the ability to apply new rent control to homes. There are still some restrictions. If Prop 21 passes, cities still could not apply rent control to homes that are at least 15 years to new homes, so anything within 15 years of new construction. And likewise, they wouldn't be able to apply to single family homes that are owned by landlords with fewer than 3 properties.
Yeah, so boy, you covered a lot in a very short period.
Yes.
Up next, we're going to talk about the law and order propositions. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Ben Christopher with CalMatters is our guest, and he's noted that, quote, California, the home of 3-strike sentencing, has spent the last decade rethinking its approach to criminal justice. 2 measures on the November ballot, channeling the spirit of the 90s, are pushing to reverse that reversal, unquote. So Ben, let's talk about the first one. That's Prop 25, which raises the question about whether we should keep cash bail or ditch it. What can you tell us about Prop 25?
Sure. So this is the one referendum on this year's ballot. We were talking about a referendum being sort of the people's veto. So in 2018, the state legislature passed a bill to ban bail, or to eliminate bail in California. So rather than letting people pay their way out of jail when they're awaiting trial, the law gives judges the right to determine whether someone who is arrested should be kept behind bars, or if the risk that they are deemed to pose to themselves or others is too great and they should stay. So obviously the bail bond industry is not pleased with this law when it passed, and they launched a campaign to put the question on the ballot as a referendum. So voters will either vote yes to keep the state law and abolish cash bail, making California the first state to do so, or they'll vote no to keep the cash bail system.
Yeah, it's not as if, they're saying just releasing people after arraignment. They're saying they're going to use a risk assessment tool to see what the risk of these folks are, as opposed to just relying on, do you have money to post bail? And these are some big numbers here. I mean, in 2018, when they first did this, the bail industry issued $6 billion in bail bonds and collected $560 million in bail bond fees. So we're talking about some pretty big money. You can understand why they want to change this law.
They're fighting for their industry.
Right, exactly.
If this, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the other criminal justice proposition is Prop 20, which would attempt to roll back Jerry Brown's efforts in his last 2 terms of governor, which he was trying to reverse the tough on crime policies he introduced during his first 2 terms as governor in the 70s and 80s. What can you tell us about Prop 20?
Sure. So the big picture here is that California has experienced this kind of sea change in how criminal justice policy is done over the last decade, as you mentioned. And so specifically in 2014, voters passed Prop 47, which downgraded a number of property crimes, knocking them from the felony list down to misdemeanors. And likewise, in 2016, voters passed Prop 57, which was based on the idea that there are a lot of people in California prisons serving these very long prison sentences, sometimes for nonviolent crimes, thanks to laws like 3 strikes. So Prop 57 made it easier for inmates convicted of nonviolent felonies to qualify for potential early release, meaning that they can apply to a parole board. And you can think of Prop 20, it's kind of a grab bag, but it's kind of a response or a backlash to all of that. So it would make it easier to once again consider certain property crimes as felonies. It would expand the number of offenses that disqualify a person from being considered for early release. It would boost penalties for violating parole, and it would require law enforcement to collect DNA samples from people convicted of certain misdemeanors like shoplifting.
Yeah, and the 3 strikes law was spearheaded by a person out of Fresno, Mike Reynolds, when his daughter was murdered, and so that was a big attempt at kind of being tough on crime. But then people rolled back. But part of that too was also the overcrowding in the California prisons, where the federal courts are saying, you've got to reduce the number of people, and so this was one of the attempts to kind of reduce the prison population. And the other thing too is going on, what's interesting, crime has been kind of steady or going down for the most part for quite some time. Is crime still a big political issue?
It's a great question. I mean, I think whether this passes or not will be an indication of whether, after the pendulum swinging one way and then the other, whether it is once again going that tough on crime direction, or whether this is maybe more like the last gasp of that tough on crime movement. And so we'll see.
I guess the voters will tell us.
Yeah.
Well, up next, we're going to talk about the employment propositions. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our guest is Ben Christopher from CalMatters, and he's noted that, quote, usually standoffs between employees and their bosses take place behind closed doors. In California, you often find them on the ballot, unquote. Good point, Ben. So listen, let's talk about Prop 22. That's perhaps the other really biggie on the November ballot. It deals with self-employment for ride-hail and other app drivers. The question is whether they should be treated as employees with all the benefits that employees have and legal protections that the employees enjoy, or whether they should be independent contractors with all the freedom and flexibility that implies. What can you tell us about Prop 22?
Sure. So Prop 22 is a response to a bill that the state legislature passed last year called Assembly Bill 5. And AB 5, which actually codified a state Supreme Court ruling, makes it much more difficult for companies to categorize their workers as independent contractors. So gig economy companies like Lyft and Uber and Instacart, their entire business model is based on coordinating a fleet of independent contractors as their drivers and delivery people. And so they argue that, as you say, that the flexibility is sort of the entire appeal of these jobs. Opponents, particularly in organized labor, say that gig economy companies abuse their workers, abuse the independent contractor classification so that they don't have to pay things like minimum wage or overtime or provide workers' compensation or anything like that. So to get around AB 5, these companies are introducing this measure that would exempt them and their workers from the law. And there would be some labor requirements, so it would almost create this kind of third classification. They would have to pay a certain a minimum pay, a health insurance stipend for drivers, but it's far less than would be required if, say, Uber or Lyft had to treat their drivers as employees. And it's clearly worth a lot to these companies because they've already spent $185 million back in Prop 22.
And on the other side, unions have spent $10 million. So not a lot. What's interesting about this, we talked about when we were off air for a second, and that is unions have always been strong about getting the vote out by knocking on doors and making calls. But with the pandemic, since they don't have the financial resources to compete with Uber and Lyft, now maybe they don't have the people to knock on doors because of the pandemic. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. But it's, obviously, they're putting a lot of money into this, the companies, because it's essential to their business model. That's what they believe.
Yeah, if you've seen an ad this year about a proposition, I guarantee it's Prop 22.
You're right. Yes, they've been on TV quite a bit. Let me ask you about that on radio. Prop 23 is another repeat dealing with dialysis clinics. This looks like it's an old labor dispute that just keeps coming back.
Exactly. So this would require dialysis clinics to have at least one physician on site at all times and to report patient infection data to California health officials. So the background here is that there's this long-standing dispute between these two companies, DaVita and Fresenius Medical Care, which together own a majority of the for-profit dialysis clinics in the state, and then SEIU, United Healthcare Workers Union, The union has been trying to unionize dialysis clinic workers for years. They've sponsored legislation to impose new restrictions on these companies. In 2018, they sponsored a ballot measure to cap the profits on these companies. None of that has succeeded, but it has forced these companies to spend a lot of money against them. And so while the supporters of this measure will argue that these clinics do suffer from quality issues and this is an earnest attempt to regulate them, a lot of people will argue that these are pressure tactics to bring the companies to the bargaining table.
Yeah, before the Uber and Lyft situation, that proposition, this one last time around was, I think, the highest in terms of cost. I think $111 million, I think, was spent on this, something like that.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah. A lot of money. Let's talk about Prop 24, another one of these, haven't we seen this before, propositions, one dealing with stronger consumer privacy laws. What can you tell us about Prop 24?
Sure. So again, 2018, a San Francisco real estate developer named Alistair McTaggart decided that large tech companies were gathering way too much data about consumers, and so he sponsored a ballot measure. Democrats in the legislature were worried that the measure would maybe go too far. It wasn't very clearly written, so they stepped in and brokered a deal between McTaggart and the tech industry, asking McTaggart to take the ballot measure down, and in exchange, they passed what is now called the California Consumer Privacy Act, which gives consumers the right to find out about what kind of information companies are collecting about them, and also opt out of having it sold. And at least on paper, it is the strongest data privacy law in the country. But McTaggart now feels that that law really didn't go far enough. It didn't have enough enforcement. There were too many loopholes. So he's back now with another privacy measure that would go even farther.
Okay, we only got a few seconds left in this segment. I did want to ask you about Prop 14, one of those second bite of the apple propositions dealing with borrowing money for stem cell research.
Right. So 2014, voters passed Prop 71 to borrow $3 million and create the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which channels state money towards stem cell research. That $3 million is now almost gone. So they're coming for a re-up of a $5.5 billion bond that would fund the agency into the future.
Wow, that is quite a comprehensive review with Ben Christopher of CalMatters. Thanks so much, Ben, for being with us. I'm Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.